Hi, my name is Dan Spencer. I'm the director of the Environmental Studies program, and this is a guest talk for Neva Hassanen's Environmental Studies 225 class, looking at the connection between ecological restoration and sustainable communities. To do this talk, I'm going to share a PowerPoint with you and then work through the PowerPoint together to organize the talk. And let me see if I can pull that up right here. So you should now be seeing this here, and I'll start it here. So this talk is called Ecological Restoration and Sustainable Communities, Milltown Dam Removal and Restoration of the Upper Clark Fork Watershed. And so I'm going to talk for about 45, 50 minutes or so and work my way through this here. I'm sorry I can't be with you live in person. Would love to have the interaction with you, a chance to talk about these issues, but we'll go ahead here. Neva asked me to start by talking a little bit about myself so you know who I am and what I'm doing. I'm both a professor in the Environmental Studies program and currently am the director of the program. And I have diverse backgrounds. My undergraduate degree is in geology. So I studied geology, and this is actually a picture taken of me in the Tobacco Root Mountains where I used to teach geology field camp. Then I have graduate degrees in ethics, theology, and philosophy. So I span several different disciplines, mostly in the humanities, particularly environmental ethics. Some of you I have had already in my Nature and Society class, and others of you I look forward to having in future classes there. I've been teaching at UM since about 2002, so about 18 years now. And I have several different areas of interest that I use in the program here. So I mentioned one of my main areas of interest is environmental ethics, thinking about how we think about environmental issues, what are some of the values and things we take for that. I also work in the field of ecological restoration, and that's what I'll be talking about quite a bit today, so I'll have more to say about that. I spent a lot of my career working on issues overseas, particularly in Latin America, but also more recently in Southeast Asia and Vietnam, looking at climate change issues. So I'm interested in globalization, how the global economy affects environmental and social justice issues. And I also look at the intersection between religion and the environment. Currently, I'm teaching a graduate seminar called The Greening of Religion, Nature, and the Environment. Next year, I have a couple different undergraduate classes you might be interested in. In the fall, I'll be teaching Nature and Society. That's a required class for our environmental studies major. Some of you I've already had in there. Others of you I hope I'll see. And there again, it meets the history general education requirement as well. And then next spring, I'll be teaching a favorite class of mine called Earth Ethics, which is an environmental ethics class where we take an applied approach looking at several different case studies. So that's a little bit about me. The goals that I have for today are several. I want to talk to you a little bit about what's the context for ecological restoration here in Montana and how I've been working in it for about the last 20 years here. And then to do that, I'll define what I mean by ecological restoration and how practitioners of the field talk about that a little bit here. And then because I'm an ethicist, I'm interested in the question of what counts as good restoration. There is lots of different kinds of restoration out there, but I'm going to argue some different components make it count as good restoration. And then we'll take a look at a case study, the case of the restoration of the Upper Clark Fork River and Milltown Dam removal, and see if that qualifies as an example of good restoration. So let's go ahead and get started here. I have some preliminary thoughts to think about restoration here. One of the things that restoration has us do is it has us rethink our place in and on the land. How do we meet our goals of having healthy communities, healthy watersheds, lands, and forests? So one of the really important things I think you'll notice about this definition is it looks at the intersection of who we are as communities, and you've been looking at the question of sustainable communities this semester, but then how do we do those rooted in the lands, in our watersheds, our lands, and our forests? Connected to that then is the vision of restoration. Restoration, I would say, is both a hopeful and a humble practice there. And I'll talk a little bit more about why that is. But the goal of restoration is to develop an ethical partnership with the land and protecting and preserving its ecological integrity. So I think restoration offers a very hopeful vision at this time of in our environmental work. We have a lot of legacy of environmental degradation, but restoration gives us a way to think about how to live more sustainably with the land there. Our immediate context for this talk here, I first started talking about this about 15 years ago when Governor Brian Schweitzer called together a conference on thinking about how restoration could inform Montana's economy and life there. And he asked me to give a plenary address there where I outlined some of my thoughts about that. One of the things I'm hopeful is that restoration may well signal the emergence of a new economic paradigm that would complement some of the earlier environmental paradigms. The 20th century environmental movement was largely shaped by preservation, trying to preserve wild places and preserve ecological integrity, and by conservation. How do we use our resources wisely and thoughtfully on there? Restoration is a third alternative for how we relate to the land, and I'll talk a little bit more about how that comes along there. In Montana, it has an immediate context in that Montana is one of the few state constitutions that guarantees its citizens a right to a clean and healthful environment. And because Montana has over 100,000 mine claims that have left a lot of degradation in the land, as well as effects from logging, river manipulation and so forth, there's a lot of damage in Montana that can be cleaned up and restored to have this clean and healthful environment. Now, the broader context beyond Montana is what we're seeing right now in the early 20th century is a long legacy of ecological degradation around the world here. We see now a situation of global ecological changes and breakdown. We see this in the loss of biodiversity. We see it in climate change. We see it in the rise of toxic environments, both in our oceans and our air and our waters there. And so there's a lot of things that can be addressed in terms of ecological degradation here. And ecological restoration now is emerging both as a practice, very specific practices, but also as a way of thinking about our relationship to the natural world and whether that should be a restorative position so that we work to reverse some of the degradation that we have caused here. In Montana, there's also been this notion of shifting to an ecological framework for the economy and the community. Montana comes out of historically a natural resource extraction economy, and we're shifting from that Montana now as we're starting to restore some of that damage and think about restoration as a possible framework for how our economy and communities can function in Montana. Now, when we talk about ecological restoration, I say there's several different key stakeholders we need to think about who are involved in restoration. First of all, restoration oftentimes involves government agencies, both at the local, the state, and the federal level. Many of the funding comes from these state governments there, as well as the laws and policies that guide restoration. So restoration, because it involves working with the land and manipulating that land for ecological purposes, always involves a government at some level. It also involves conservationists. Conservationists are finding that ecological restoration is a powerful tool for accomplishing some of the aims of conservation and the wise use of our resources here. Increasingly, restoration involves the private sector. My partner, Pat Burke, for example, had a restoration company called Bitterroot Restoration that he ran for 20 years, working with government agencies and local landowners in terms of carrying out restoration as a practice, as a business there. At the University of Montana, there are many of us who are involved in restoration, and so we see educational and research communities are also deeply involved in restoration. You can take courses in ecological restoration in the College of Forestry, in the Environmental Studies program, several other places across campus. And the area that I'm also particularly interested in is the intersection between restoration and our communities and citizens. Restoration has been going for 20 or 30 years as a very involved practice, and it has really evolved as a community-based practice involving citizens in volunteer work on restoration. So those are some of the key human stakeholders. I think it's also important to recognize beyond them, there's a whole nother set of stakeholders here that I would list as Montana's native flora and fauna. These are the plants and animals, the ecosystems that are most directly involved in both the degraded areas of Montana, but especially the hopeful vision for restoring them and bringing them back to a place of ecological integrity. So that's a little background there. What do we actually mean by ecological restoration? I'm going to take a couple different definitions here to give us a sense about this here. One of them is by a colleague and friend of mine, Eric Higgs, who teaches at the University of Victoria. And he said ecological restoration is a worldwide movement of people assisting the recovery of ecological and cultural integrity. What I like about this definition is it reminds us that restoration is a practice. It's a movement, it's a social movement, and it involves our communities. And it's trying to recover both ecological integrity, that is restoring damaged ecosystems, but also cultural integrity. As we've seen, and you've probably talked about in this class here, ecological degradation simultaneously oftentimes harms the peoples that are living on those places, whether those are indigenous peoples who've lived there for millennia. Sometimes we see it in terms of communities of color or socially marginalized communities who are degraded by environmental problems there. And so when we seek to address the ecological integrity, we're also trying to recover cultural integrity in that notion. One of the ways I think about that sometimes, and I talk with my students in saying is, as we restore the land, we're also restoring ourselves to the land in a healthy manner. So that's one definition of ecological restoration. Another one is a definition that's put forth by the Society for Ecological Restoration, which I've been involved in for many years here. And this is their formal definition. They say ecological restoration is the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that has been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. Now, there's several important parts to this definition to think about here. One is ecosystems have been degraded, damaged, or destroyed, usually by human actions. And so this is a way of taking responsibility for the actions we've done here. The second is, you notice it's a process of assisting the recovery. The primary work of ecological restoration is actually done by the ecosystems themselves and ecological processes that use natural processes, water cycle, carbon cycle, soil formation, these different kinds of things to carry out the recovery of an ecosystem. And what we're doing in restoration is assisting that process, sometimes accelerating it, sometimes helping it overcome hurdles so that recovery of an ecosystem can happen. So restoration is related to a number of other, what I call the RE words. You're going to hear about things like rehabilitation, reclamation, remediation, so forth. And so I want to just take three different ones here. These are all different activities that are used in modifying the biota and physical site conditions of our lands here. So we'll take a quick look at reclamation, remediation, and restoration. Reclamation and remediation both have a long history in our country here. We have a Bureau of Reclamation set up for doing that. We also have remediation as the primary work of the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. So it's important to take a look at how restoration relates to those activities. Reclamation, the original context really began at the end of the 1800s. And this was this effort, particularly in the western part of the United States, to make land fit for cultivation, usually by damming rivers, making reservoirs, and bringing irrigation projects to lands there in the arid West in order to make the land able to grow crops. And so the Bureau of Reclamation has been working for over 100 years in developing irrigation schemes, dams, and so forth throughout the western part of the United States to bring agriculture to the land through irrigation. The aim then of this is to reclaim the land for what was understood as a useful or proper state for human use. So this is something we would definitely call a utilitarian focus. It's reworking the land in order to make it function for human purposes there. In that sense, reclamation does not usually focus on what the earlier original state of the land was in that ecological integrity, because it's intentionally manipulating the land to make it useful for human use, whether that's for forestry, agriculture, mining, or so forth. Now, a second one is the field of remediation. And you will hear a lot about remediation when connected to restoration, because this is the work of sometimes of the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. Remediation is defined simply as the act or process of remedying something that's considered undesirable or deficient, such as remediation of pollution from factories there. So remediation is a process of providing a remedy to a problem. And for environmental situations there, it's oftentimes trying to remove the source of pollution that's a threat to both human and environmental health. It has a different goal and set of strategies from restoration. For the EPA, remediation is defined as cleanup or other methods used to remove or contain a toxic spill or hazardous materials from a Superfund site. So it's very much connected to Superfund cleanup there. And the standards are removing to the site to a situation of both human health and environmental health on that. An important thing about understanding this is remediation does not necessarily require returning a site to its previous ecological state or condition. And as we'll see, that's an important feature of what goes on in ecological restoration there. So in contrast to reclamation and remediation, we could ask, what is ecological restoration? It's an intentional activity that initiates or accelerates the recovery of an ecosystem with respect to its health, integrity, and sustainability. So in contrast to both reclamation and remediation, the goal of restoration is to bring an ecosystem back to some connection with its historical state prior to it being damaged or degraded on that here. And so, as I mentioned, the SER's, the Society for Ecological Restoration's definition, sees this as a process of assisting this recovery when ecosystems are damaged, or degraded, damaged, or destroyed. So there are several elements then when we think about returning ecological integrity. We have to ask ourselves, what do we mean by ecological integrity in that sense here? One of these has to do with ecological processes and structures. Ecologists, when they study ecosystems, look at the different processes that form and maintain those ecosystems, such as water cycle, carbon cycle, soil formation, a variety of different things on those processes. And oftentimes when we degrade or damage lands and ecosystems, those processes themselves begin to break down. So we see a return of those ecological processes and the structures they create to that land, that ecosystem there. Ecological integrity always takes place in a regional and historical context. And in most places in the world, these ecological processes also intersect with how humans have occupied those lands and places, such in this case as the Native Americans who occupied these lands and lived in them for many, many millennia here. A key component, of course, to ecological integrity is the native biodiversity. What's the array of plants and animals that evolved in that place, oftentimes co-evolving with human communities there, but have led to the evolving or evolution of particularly ecosystems that sometimes have been damaged on that here. And then all of this is wrapped up over time with most cultures having sustainable cultural practices. For example, much of the tall grass prairie in the Midwestern part of this country here is a result of Native Americans burning the prairie regularly in order to provide food for the bison, the elk, and the other animals that evolved there. And so these practices were sustainable, both cultural and ecological practices. So when we look at recovering ecological integrity, we need to pay attention to all these elements here there in thinking about how to bring those back to an ecosystem. So the bottom line when we start thinking about restoration, and particularly here in Montana, is we begin to shift away from a utilitarian way of thinking to an ecological way of thinking in restoring and relating to the land, where the ecosystems and living sustainably with them guide our processes on that. Now, that's what ecological restoration is kind of as a field and a practice. As an ethicist, I'm always interested in asking this question, then what counts as good ecological restoration? And even asking that question presupposes then that there could be examples of bad restoration. So there are a number of philosophers and ethicists who've been paying attention to this, trying to think about what would count as good ecological restoration. And I think an important thing to think about this here is remembering that ecological restoration is always simultaneously a social ecological act. Now, what do I mean by that? It's clearly it's an ecological act because we're trying to restore integrity to ecosystems. So we're working with the plants and animals, ecological processes there. But it's always it's simultaneously an action that's done by human beings. It's done in a social context. It oftentimes requires significant financial resources. It requires working with the government, requires the consent of communities that are involved there. So restoration is simultaneously a social and an ecological act. And that can help us to start thinking about what would count as good ecological restoration. My colleague, Eric Higgs, who I mentioned before, has this simple diagram to help us think about three nested circles that are involved in good restoration. One is the very core is restoration needs to be effective. It needs to be effective ecologically if it's going to restore damaged ecosystems. And so Eric Higgs talks about it needs to satisfy what we call ecological fidelity. Ecologists have several different ways of measuring this. I'm not going to go into detail here, but you look at structural compositional replication, functional success, and how durable the restoration is. So you're trying to return the native plants and animals to the area there and make sure that they exist through time. The second level recognizes that restoration requires a lot of resources to carry it out well. And so we want to think about how it can be done well, efficiently, in terms of good use of economic resources. But the third area is the area that I'm particularly interested in. This is this expanded conception of thinking about the social factors involved in restoration. Restoration has to do with our historical placement in landscapes. It has to do with the cultural practices that evolved in those places there. It has to do with the current social structures involved, the political realities in there, the values that we have in terms of moral things there, and what we see as beauty, what we see aesthetically in a place there. All of those factors are wrapped up in restoration. And if we pay good attention to them, we have a much better chance of having restoration be good restoration. So Eric Higgs has put these down to what he calls 4 keystone concepts of good ecological restoration. So you see in the middle here, ecological restoration, and these 4 concepts, each one of them fitting in there. The first one, as we've talked about, is ecological integrity, returning the native plant and animal composition and the ecological processes there. How do we do that? We do it through what Eric Higgs calls historical fidelity. Fidelity is just simply a word that means being faithful to something there. And so restorationist tries to be faithful to understanding what are the ecosystems and the communities that evolved over time in that place. And those are what guide the restoration. So if this was a ponderosa pine forest that's been clear cut and the soil's been degraded, you want to understand how did that ponderosa pine forest evolve over time? How can that give us guidance for the restoration we're taking place there? A third component that Eric Higgs talks about is what he calls focal or community restoration. This is the involvement in communities in there where restoration becomes a primary focus of their effort there. So we simply don't have expert practitioners. We do need expert restoration practitioners for good restoration, but we also need to involve the communities that live in and amongst those areas there. And so to the degree that we can involve community restoration, it makes it a better restoration. We'll see how that comes up in the case study we will look at with Milltown Dam removal. And finally, Eric Higgs recognizes that restoration always involves design. It's an interesting thing because it's an intentional manipulation of ecosystems, but you're intentionally manipulating them to get rid of the human degradation on them, and that is to allow wild processes to return there. So what we're trying to do with ecological restoration is design a process that returns wildness, returns that ability, that ecosystem to function on its own without a lot of ongoing human manipulation of that. And Eric Higgs says if we pay attention to all 4 of these concepts, we have a better chance of developing good restoration projects here. So with that there, what I would say about restoration in sum is it's recovering the value of ecological integrity. We recognize that ecosystems exist not just for the resources they provide human beings, but they have value for their own sake. Tallgrass prairie, an alpine riparian system there, river system, pine forest, and the suite of animals that they support there all have their value for their own sake, what we would call intrinsic value there. And so one of the things we recognize here is that because so much of the damage there has been caused by humans, we now have the opportunity, we have the tools to repair that damage. So damage that's caused by humans is repaired by humans through the act of restoration here. The good news is we increasingly have both the technology and the science to help us understand this. There's a growing field called restoration ecology that takes the insights of ecology and applies that to restoring damaged ecosystems. And increasingly we have better and better tools and technology to make this possible to do that. What's primarily needed now to carry out restoration is taking responsibility, that is moral responsibility for the damage we've done, and developing the political will to get it done. And with that combination, then we can have restoration really be a win-win solution. It's enlightened self-interest for us, humankind, because we need healthy ecosystems to support ourselves. But it also honors and values the values that nature has for itself, a vibrant and healthy nature. So with that background, I'm going to keep focusing on this one key element that I really value in restoration, and that is combining community participation with professional and scientific expertise. There's a growing field of professional restoration practitioners, and they bring a lot of experience, a lot of skill, a lot of expertise to that there. But I think restoration is best when that intersects with communities that also become involved and engaged in that. So what would I say about good restoration in sum? Primarily seeks to achieve a higher degree of ecological integrity, where we restoring the composition of the native plants and animals of that area. And in that process, we're trying to reintegrate ourselves into ecosystems in sustainable ways. Restoration, unlike the other RE words, makes reference to the past. It's loyal to the past conditions not necessarily trying to replicate them, but to be something, an ecosystem that's in continuity with what has long existed in that place and time there. So restoration is not just landscaping or reshaping an area for our own human ends. It says the ecosystems and the plants and animals that evolved in that place make a claim on us, and we are doing our best to return them to a healthy condition, that they have as much right to live in those lands as we do here. Ideally, restoration involves local communities. It works best when it's maintained over time, when local communities have buy-in on that and when they participate in that, so they have a stake in the restoration that comes out. And it's framed ecologically. In restoration, ecological values have priority over utilitarian concerns. This is a contrast with things like reclamation, where you're reshaping ecosystems through irrigation schemes, things like that, because of human concerns for increasing utility. In restoration, it's the ecological values that have priority, so we reshape our way of living in the lands in order to maximize those ecological values. The promise of restoration, I would summarize this, is to be sustaining the diversity of life in Montana and reestablishing an ecologically healthy relationship between nature and culture, between ecology and the economy in Montana. And this is the vision we developed back in 2006 when we did the Governor's Restoration Summit meeting there, about this being a vision statement for how restoration could increasingly shape the economy and way of living here in Montana. Now, I'm going to take now to move it a little bit. How does this take place here, this restoration vision for Montana, way of restoring the land and restoring ourselves to the land here? And I'm going to use the local example of all the work that's going into restoring the Upper Clark Fork River through the work of the Clark Fork Coalition here. And I'm going to give thanks particularly to my friend Will McDowell. This is Will right here in the picture there. Will and I are actually college classmates from way back in the 1970s. We go back a long time here. I worked closely with Will, particularly in the graduate class that I teach on ethical issues in restoration. And Will is a regular presenter to my class, and he has furnished many of the slides that are in this talk here. So Will, thank you for that work there, and thank you to all the members of the Clark Fork Coalition who are doing this work of restoring the Clark Fork River. Here's a map that shows the Clark Fork watershed. And you can see we sit kind of right in the very central part of it here, coming together where the Bitterroot River and the Clark Fork River are joined by the Blackfoot River, Rattlesnake Creek, and this 5 valleys here. They're the main of the Clark Fork River, which then flows into Idaho and then eventually joins the Columbia River here. The Clark Fork River is Montana's largest waterway in terms of volume of water as it leaves the state. The next two are the Yellowstone River and the Missouri River. The Yellowstone River and the Missouri River join a little bit east of the Montana border to become the very large Missouri River, but the Clark Fork River drains the western third of the state here and a lot of the Rocky Mountain area there, about 22,000 square miles. It's home to about 1/3 of Montana's population as well, and several major tributaries, the Bitterroot River coming in from the south, the Blackfoot River coming in from the east, Rock Creek is right along this area here, as well as several others there. It has its headwaters in the Butte and Anaconda area there. Silverbow Creek coming out of Butte, Warm Springs Creek coming out of Anaconda, form up to become the Clark Fork River here. And this is the Upper Clark Fork watershed that starts from Missoula up into Butte, which is the home of one of the largest Superfund site complexes in the country here. And largely, as we'll see there, because of the mining and smelting activity that took place historically in these communities here. So this is a view now in a little more detail of the Upper Clark Fork River. It's about 3,700 square miles, about 120 miles from Missoula in the northwest to Butte in the southeast. Starts here in Butte and flows downriver through the Deer Lodge Valley, through the Garrison area, and in the Clark Fork River to Missoula. And there it is. Now, one of the things to be aware of is this historically was the land of the Salish and Kalispel and several other different indigenous groups here. This is a painting that shows the Salish peoples in camp. This is where Rattlesnake Creek comes into the Clark Fork River in today's Missoula. If you were looking at this today, you'd see the L up here on the slopes of Mount Jumbo here. And so this is an area that's been inhabited for tens of thousands of years by several different indigenous groups there, who have a deep knowledge of this land and traditional ecological knowledge. You can see this here. Now, this was a traditional fishing trap of the Salish encampment on a creek in the watershed here. And the native practices and knowledge of the area deeply inform the kind of restoration that we're trying to carry out to bring continuity with that history. The problem we face today, however, is 2 centuries of a legacy of misuse of these lands. This is the open pit mining in Butte, Montana. This is the old large smelter in Anaconda. Here is Deer Lodge, where the contaminated river has flown through that area here. And here's the former Milltown Dam site of the Milltown Power Plant, where the Blackfoot River and the Clark Fork River come together. So we're going to be taking a look at this here. It flows out of the history of mining in particular. Butte, Montana was known as the richest hill on earth. Mining began there in the 1870s, and then nearby developed the smelters in Anaconda there. And this was really the economic engine that developed much of the state of Montana, that area there. Butte produced huge quantities of copper that led to the electrification of America. It was very important in the war efforts, World War I and World War II, still is. But it left behind 10 million tons of ore and then a lot of waste there. This is what's known as the Berkeley Pit. It was the open pit mining the mining stopped there in the early 1980s, and it's since been filling up with groundwater, which is now a very toxic site there. This is the city of Butte, right in the area there. And then there's active mining going on in this pit over here. But all of these are toxic waste sites here. And this is the headwaters of the Clark Fork River. So their destiny of this waste has been very, very important. Over the last century and a half, much of it has flowed into the Clark Fork River and contaminated it. A key event that we're going to be looking at related to Milltown took place about 110 years ago, and that was the big flood of 1908. Considered by many to be a 500-year event. It rained for 33 consecutive days in May and early June on top of the snowpack there, and created catastrophic flooding. This is the flood at its peak level where it was flowing over the Milltown Dam. The Milltown Dam had been dedicated just 5 months before, in January of 2008, to electrify the lumber mills there, and also to electrify the city of Missoula and the electric streetcar line there. This is the power plant here. There was deep concern that the dam would collapse under the flood. It held there, fortunately, but one of the things that happened was it trapped a lot of those toxic waste sediments there in the reservoir afterwards there. And so, but the slugs of the metals are delivered of this, then, let me see if I can get this forward here, started here in Butte, and the flooding washed all this down here until it reached Milltown here, and then it impounded behind the dam there and contaminated the whole floodplain here for these 120 miles. So that's what the Superfund site is doing, is cleaning up. There's several different complexes here. They're cleaning up about 45 miles of this upper part of the river here, as well as the Milltown area. So the Milltown Dam was built from the 1905 to 1907, then powered up 1908, and then filled with toxic sediments here. This is the old reservoir behind the dam there, became filled with these toxic sediments. Nobody paid much attention to that for about 75 years because there was the lumber mills were up and running, the railroad was running, the thriving community here, and people didn't pay much attention to thinking about the toxic sediments that were contained there. That began to change in the late 70s, early 80s, when people in the nearby Milltown, which is right here on the edge of the Milltown Dam, community of Bonners over here, they began to notice that their drinking water started to smell and it had a bad color to it. And so they tested it and found out that the wells were being contaminated by arsenic and other heavy metals there. Several people came in from the University of Montana and started studying this, and they realized there was a toxic plume of under the sediments of the Milltown Dam here that were contaminating the groundwater. And so that set a process in place now of a process that would be getting cleanup there. But it took nearly 30 years. And so this question that my colleague Will has raised there, how do you force the cleanup of a 100-year-old problem that people have been living with there? This is a very dramatic picture because you actually see here's the Blackfoot River coming in here. Notice the difference in the water quality from the Clark Fork River coming in here. This is all the different sediments that were washing down there from the mine, the contaminated sediments up there, and then washing over the Milltown Dam. So you can even see it where the two rivers come together. So the question is, how do you bring about a cleanup like this here? Well, a key one here has been the whole thing of grassroots advocacy. The public participation in forcing the cleanup of the Clark Fork River has been really significant here in Missoula. And these are pictures of float trips that started at the Milltown Dam down there to bring attention to the contamination in the river led by the Clark Fork Coalition. So the timeline of the Milltown River, just to give us a little sense about that here, the flood event took place in 1908. About 75 years later, 1981, arsenic is starting to be detected in the Milltown residence wells there. 2 years later, Milltown Reservoir is placed on the first national priority list for the Superfund site there. The Superfund law was passed in 1980, but 3 years later, they had the first national priority list, and the Milltown Reservoir made that list in terms of that area there. 2 years after that, in 1985, they did develop a new drinking water system for the residents of Milltown. And again, this took pressure off doing anything else with the sediments for a while because the local people now had clean water to drink there. People didn't spend too much more time thinking about the reservoir. Yet people at the university were aware that this was a ticking time bomb, that these sediments were going there. And that came to a head in 1996 when there was an ice flow event on the Blackfoot River coming down through here there, that a big sheet of ice was coming down here, and there was real concern that it would destroy the dam and take the dam out there. And so the dam operators lowered the water level in the reservoir in order to ground the ice there and prevent it from taking out the dam. But that scouring of the ice there released a lot of toxic sediments, led to a big fish kill in the dam there. And that led to renewed pressure to start the cleanup of the sediment there. The preferred option by ARCO, Atlantic Richfield Company, which was the responsible party, was to simply strengthen the dam and take care and treat the sediments in place there. But the Clark Fork Coalition in the year 2000 started a campaign to actually remove the dam and restore the river with this slogan called "Remove the Dam, Restore the River" there. And this became a massive public participation process there to bring pressure on the government to do that. A key event is they built it since several years, building up a lot of public support for this. And a key event was when the Republican governor, Judy Martz, announced her support for the dam removal in 2003. With that, it became a bipartisan issue of people on both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party supporting this here, and both senators supporting it there. And so a year later, in the end of 2004, the Environmental Protection Agency issued its record of decision, what's called a ROD, and it called for the removal of the dam and the sediments there. The dam then took another 4 years until Milltown Dam was actually removed in 2008. As part of that, they started removing the sediments in 2007, and that was a 2-year process to remove these contaminated sediments. This created a whole nother level of controversy, which we'll talk about a moment here, because the question was, what do you do with these contaminated sediments there? The initial proposals was just to move them basically a mile away from there and create a new kind of a repository on the slopes of the Clark Fork River, a lined sediment repository where you could just take these toxic sediments, move them there, and that would have created kind of a new sacrifice zone. What ultimately was decided, however, was to take advantage of the railroad being right there and to put them on railroad cars and to take them 100 miles upriver to what are called the Opportunity Ponds, which were the old tailings depositories from the smelter in Anaconda near the town of Opportunity, where there was a 4,000 acre waste depository already in place there. So we'll talk more about that because that created some really interesting debates about this here. But a key person involved in making this happen was a graduate of the Environmental Studies program, Tracy Stone Manning. In the year 2000, she was hired as the new executive director of the Clark Fork Coalition, and you may have read about her in the article by David Brooks, asked you to read for this class here. Tracy wanted to really turn the Clark Fork Coalition to be focusing on it being a community-based organization that did science-based advocacy for the water quality in the river here. And she saw the Milltown Dam as kind of a ticking time bomb, and she raised this question: why aren't we advocating for cleaning it all up and taking out the dam rather than just leaving it in place and leaving those contaminated sediments there where they threaten everybody downriver? And so Tracy and the Clark Fork Coalition launched a campaign called Remove the Dam and Restore the River. I remember this really well because this started in the year 2000, and this was the year that I first moved to Missoula. And I became really interested in this campaign and the work they were doing there. Tracy is a real shaker and mover. She led this campaign and got a lot of public participation in there. And the EPA cited strong community support when it finally chose the option of removing the dam rather than leaving it in place there, after a long campaign by the Clark Fork Coalition and its many different partners in the area there. So this you saw this bumper sticker all over Missoula. When you go, you can see it's the Clark Fork Coalition there. Remove the dam and restore the river was the slogan on that here. And so after a lot of effort, the dam came down in 2008. About March 2008, it was a really fascinating time to see them. They had to tear down the old powerhouse here. Originally, there was a goal to try to preserve it as kind of a museum, but it sits out in the middle of the river. Realized it wouldn't be structurally stable to do that. I think you may have had an opportunity to watch a video that shows the actual breaching of the dam. Fascinating kind of experience to see that happen. And then the public campaign to put pressure on the removal of the Milltown Dam has been very influential in shaping how the EPA does Superfund throughout the country now. One of the things that came out of that was the notion of doing remediation with the 3 R's. Standing for remediation, but then also restoration and redevelopment. The Superfund law focuses the EPA to make sure remediation takes place of any kind of pollutant or environmental hazard there. And that's the legal mandate for the EPA, is to simply make sure you can clean up the mess so it becomes environmentally healthy and protects human health. It doesn't require at all to do any restoration of trying to bring back that damaged area to what its ecological situation was prior to the degradation. But now in Milltown wanted to not stop at remediation, but to go on to restoration. That is, they really wanted to restore the confluence of the Clark Fork and Blackfoot rivers there, so that we become a healthy ecosystem here, riparian system. And they wanted to do that in such a way that would help the economic development of the communities that live there. These are communities that had grown up around the mills, the timber mills here, but the closing of the timber mills were economically devastated there. So could the restoration and remediation also bring economic redevelopment to this community? So it was a integrated fund with community participation on these 3 R's there. The remediation simply involved hauling the toxic sediment back upriver there. And it was 1 train a day, about 100 cars in the train there, 7 days a train, 7 days a week, went from Milltown up to 100 miles upstream to Opportunity, taking about 4,500 cubic yards per train, a total of over 2 million cubic yards over 2.5 years of hauling to get this all taken up in that area there. Once those sediments were removed, then the process became the restoration project. And this has involved a lot of revegetation, restoration, rebuilding the river there, and really trying to bring ecological restoration into the confluence site in that area there. This is now the site of a new state park, Milltown State Park, which is going to bring some of the economic redevelopment and provide opportunities there for local people to participate in that. So that's the plan and the vision that's taken place with the Milltown Dam removal here. And one of the things I want to stress here is the importance of public participation in this. The Milltown Dam removal would not have happened without the strong community activism of the Missoula community and other communities that were involved in this here. I have a quote here from David Brooks, who wrote the article we read for today here, who says the restoration of the Clark Fork did not happen because the EPA implemented an environmental law, although that law was very important, or because one political party carried forth its agenda, although it did develop bipartisan support, or because national environmental organizations rallied around a cause. Whoops. Rather, the turning point in the process hinged on local participation by university faculty, by government agents, and especially tens of thousands of interested citizens who put public pressure on the EPA and their government officials there to do a thorough cleanup by removing the Milltown Dam and removing the toxic sediments there. One evidence of this here is the EPA received over 10,000 public comments on the Milltown cleanup, which is more comments than on any previous Superfund site in the history of the EPA. And over 94% of the comments supported dam and sediment removal. This is really remarkable when you think that the population of Missoula during this time was about 50 or 60,000 people and generated over 10,000 public comments on the EPA's proposal there. Developed overwhelming public support for this there, and eventually got both Republican and Democratic political officials supporting it as well, and the EPA responded to that. Now, I mentioned before, one of the problems when you remove toxic sediments is they have to go someplace. And initially, the initial design was to actually have them stay in Missoula, not too far from the river there, and to create a new toxic waste site that would be lined and keep them out of the river, but it was still required building a whole new waste depository site there. After a long study period there, what they decided to do instead was to move these sediments up to what are called the opportunity sites, or opportunity ponds, and these are, it's a very, very extensive. You can see it, it shows up in here about 4,500 acres of toxic waste sites that came from the smelter in Anaconda. This picture here is the smelter stack there. They were piped down and just let in a slurry for many, many years. This is the waste deposits that came from the smelter there. And it created a huge toxic waste site. The decision was to take the toxic sediments out of here. You're seeing they're being dug up and removed from behind the Milltown Dam, put them on trains and bring them up to this site here, an opportunity, and unload them on here. Initially, the thought was that, let's see if I can get this back up. Initially, the thought was that there was enough organic matter in these waste ponds that they could put them on the top of the opportunity ponds, and then they were trying to get them to revegetation. Because you can see from the satellite view, nothing grows on these ponds there. They're too toxic to grow any material on there. So the hope was they could take the Milltown sediments here and put them on the site here, and then begin to grow vegetation, as you can see on some of the sites over here. They found out that that simply wouldn't work. And so residents of Opportunity became quite concerned that they were being asked to accept more toxic waste there. The town of Opportunity sits right in this area here, right just to the south of the Opportunity Ponds. And they've also been very concerned that toxic chemicals from these ponds there are seeping into their water supply. And so they raised the question, is this just an example of NIMBY, that not in my backyard, that the people of Missoula got rid of their problem by digging up the Milltown Dam, but they made it somebody else's problem by moving it up to Opportunity. And there was quite a big public debate about this here. I'll just put up here what some of the Opportunity residents said. And there's a very good book that's come out recently called Opportunity Montana, Big Copper, Bad Water, and the Burial of American Landscape by Brad Tyre. If you want to read more about this, it's a very good case study of that. But a quote here from David Brooks's article, Opportunity residents were slow to accept the idea of acquiring Milltown's mess. They wondered why the sediments that were called toxic waste in Milltown were described upriver as relatively good organic material that would help revegetate the Opportunity Pond repository. They believed rather that Opportunity had been chosen because of its declining population, high unemployment, and poor wages compared to the relatively opposite situation in David Brooks. And so people raised the question, was this an example of environmental justice or really an environmental injustice that a community that was much poorer and politically weaker than Missoula was now being forced to accept more toxic waste in that area there. And that debate continues to today with people on different sides of it here. I'll say what David Brooks's conclusion is. He says, opponents describe the issue in class terms, that is white-collar Missoula pushing Milltown's contaminants on blue-collar Opportunity. In reality, the decision has far less to do with polarized communities than ecological considerations. So David Brooks thinks it was the ecological considerations were primary. The solution to Milltown's sediment illustrated a major element of environmental cleanup. Mending one place meant sacrificing another. The agency picked an established, large, and safer place to dispose of the waste instead of creating a new repository on the margins of the floodplain. So David Brooks believes that at least that given the different possibilities, it was better to use an existing repository. They could accommodate these new toxic sediments there rather than creating a new depository that would have all the problems with flooding and so forth on that there. Nevertheless, it's been an ongoing debate here. David Brooks's conclusion about the whole thing about Milltown is as follows. In the end, restoration at Milltown was practical, scientific, cost conscious, and driven by notions of what people could do to make a section of the Clark Fork a healthier ecosystem. Restoration was, at its simplest, about recreating viable fish and wildlife habitat and making the confluence of the Clark Fork and Blackfoot rivers safe for people to enjoy. So the picture down here actually shows now the restored confluence here. Here's the Blackfoot River coming in. This is the I-90 bridge here. Here's the town of Milltown right there. Here is the restored Clark Fork River coming in. And here's the restored floodplain in that area there. One thing I'll just point out, there's a little side thing here, but if you look carefully, you can see there's all these old tree stumps. One of the things that was actually fascinating was when they removed about 20 feet worth of sediments got this whole area there. So they brought the river level down quite a bit here. When they got down there, they found the old tree stumps that had been, where the forest had been in this area here. And the other amazing thing is they uncovered 100-year-old seed bed, and the actual the old seeds began to germinate again and started to recover the vegetation on their own in this area. If you go out there today, this is taken shortly after the restoration, or the confluence was restored. If you go out there today, you'll see a lot more vegetation growing up in this area. The restoration is completing very well on that. So just a closing thought about restoration. One of the things I'd like to leave you with here and make this connection to what you're talking about in sustainable communities is to keep in mind that ecological restoration is always both an ecological and a social act. Now, what do I mean by that? In order for restoration to be good restoration, it must pay attention to both the ecological and the social dimensions of these actions, meeting both the needs of the ecosystems and the human communities that are affected by them there. So restoration is a social act because it's always carried out by people. It's carried out by people in a social context where communities are affected by it. It requires raising a lot of economic resources. You have to make choices about, do we want to do those resources in this area or use them in some other area there? People are affected by that. Their home places are affected either by the restoration or accepting the toxic waste sites there. So it's a social act, but it's also an ecological act. We're trying to restore ecological integrity to places that have been damaged and harmed by our own human actions there. So paying attention to human, social, economic, and political factors is as important as attention to restoring the ecological integrity of a place. The removal of the Milltown Dam and moving the contaminated sediments to another community illustrates some of the complex factors and trade-offs to be considered in any restoration project. So restoring Montana, as I mentioned, there's a mosaic of possibilities here. There are so many different needs in Montana and so many different communities that can be involved in that here. I find this quite a hopeful and a fascinating movement to be involved in here. If you're interested in learning more about this, as I mentioned, there are several opportunities, both at the undergraduate and the graduate level, on courses in ecological restoration. There's a student chapter of the Society for Ecological Restoration at UM that you can get involved in yourself. But please come and talk to me about it if you think you're interested here. And I'll make my last point here. I think ecological restoration plays a really important possibility for building sustainable communities. The same way that sustainable agriculture is taking place at places like the Peas Farm, ecological restoration is creating the healthy ecosystems that both healthy communities and healthy farms need to survive in a healthy and flourish. So I like to think about our landscape management as a mosaic of landscapes. Some of those lands we're going to want to leave in wilderness conditions, like the headwaters in our mountain ranges here. Some of them we're going to go up into ranch lands there. Some are going to go up into agriculture, but some we can also restore through restoration project there to keep healthy ecosystems there to support the restoration or the healthy farming, the healthy ranching, and the healthy human communities that we need here. So I'm going to stop this at this point here and just speak to for the last moment here. I want to thank you again for paying attention to my talk here. I hope this is a helpful part of you learning about another dimension of sustainable communities there. And you've had a good opportunity all semester working with NEVA and doing that there. And I hope I will see some of you in classes later in either my Nature Society class or some of my other classes there. Last thing, I just want to invite you for the last few weeks of the semester. We are doing a virtual coffee hour and every Wednesday afternoon from 4 o'clock to 5:15. Susan Elliott, many of you know Susan from the office. I'll be there. A lot of our faculty will be there. And we just invite you to join us, to just come and check in with us. Let us know how things are going. I want to wish you well in the last few weeks of the semester here. As we've been all shifting to remote teaching, and I hope you all have a very good summer as well. So thank you so much for your attention and take care.